Hello, everyone. My name is Onika Winston from Collaborate.
And I'm Gabriel Eichsteller from Tempra Social Pedagogy.
Welcome to another episode of our podcast series, Changing the Narrative, in which we're exploring and sharing insights from various human learning systems, examples of practice that have what we think are interesting and helpful insights into embedding equity practices and principles into work. We hope this series is valuable for everyone, but particularly for practitioners who would like to understand better how human learning systems practice can intersect with intentional equity and inclusion practices. Today, we're joined by Pegs Bailey, who has been involved in No One Left Behind for the Opportunities Fife Partnership. Before we begin, could you share a bit about Fife as an area and about the No One Left Behind work?
Sure thing. Fife is in Scotland, just over the water from Edinburgh. It's a rural local authority area, or a mix of rural and urban, and it's actually the third largest local authority in Scotland, with a mixture of very wealthy and very impoverished communities, agricultural, industrial, and so on. Yeah, so and No One Left Behind, or the program that we're talking about today was came about because Scottish government actually really changed how it was thinking about funding and commissioning employability services across Scotland, and it moved from a situation where it had multiple pockets of funding, some national, some local, but kind of all delivered by different agencies, to one pot under the banner of No One Left Behind, which would be devolved down to local authorities, and which the aspiration was that would be delivered, planned and commissioned and delivered in partnership with many different agencies, but that also that the decisions around how that money got spent should be informed by the experiences of people who were using services. And really, we kind of grabbed hold of that intention in Fife. And because we'd had a background of doing work around collaborative, co-produced responses to things like mental health and employment, we had a kind of a little bit of an inkling of how we might make that happen in the context of No One Left Behind. So yeah, that was in 2019 to 20.
Great. Thanks for sharing that really helpful context about how No One Left Behind came about. I wonder if you can say a little bit more about how was No One Left Behind different from other employability programs, and what was the role of equity within that? Why did you consider equity?
Okay, so I think there's an interesting thing. No One Left Behind as a policy was different for two important reasons from our perspective. One was because it was being devolved, so they wanted locally commissioned, locally relevant employability services, and there was one pot instead of lots of different pots managed by different agencies. So that was one big difference. It meant that in Fife, we, as a partnership, had ownership over how all the money was going to get spent. And that was kind of a big change, and it kind of gave us a real impetus for thinking quite hard about how we wanted to do that well. And the second thing that was really different was around this idea that it should be person-centered and it should be informed not just by kind of what policy people might think, but this bigger intention that it should be the plans for commissioning and designing and thinking about delivery should be informed by a range of perspectives. And so it felt like it had a kind of equity intention. I guess even the name No One Left Behind suggests that we really need to think about who we're working with, who we're supporting, and who we're serving. And I think we were just really lucky in Fife that because of previous work that we'd done, we were able to kind of grab that quite early and run with that. And I think what's great is that's happening more and more in other areas across Scotland now.
What were some of the early things you did to consider equity within your project?
Yeah, so I guess from the get-go, one of the things that we'd learned through previous programs was the importance of having everyone in the room as early as possible, or not everyone, but as big a diversity of voices in the room before we even really began to think about how we were going to do our engagement work. Because I suppose our commitment, our intention with this was not to design a program for delivery, but to design a commissioning framework that would then guide what services got commissioned and how they got commissioned. So we weren't designing a program, but we were trying to understand what we needed in Fife and what might look different. I think that's probably quite important to be clear about. So I think in terms of equity, one of the first things we did was pretty much the first planning meeting, or sort of, it might even have been a kind of almost behind the scenes planning meeting. We brought together people who were delivering services, people who were other strategic partners, and we encouraged the people delivering services to bring along people who were using their services, to just bring along you might call it a client. And we also had people who'd been involved in lived experience work at Fife Voluntary Action who were keen to be part of that conversation as well. So at that very first planning meeting, we wanted to make sure that before we even started coming up with what was the problem we were trying to solve, or how we would go about trying to understand what the challenges were, that we were doing that collaboratively. And that's important for me in terms of equity, because if you don't, it's very easy to set up your structure for engagement and then go and try and reach as many audiences as possible, but already you might have designed in unintentionally questions which feel exclusionary or approaches which feel exclusionary. So yeah, that, and even just kind of having that first meeting as being, it was quite scruffy, it was quite messy. I think the only tech we had was a flip chart. We didn't over engineer it. We tried to keep it as as simple and human and kind of just straightforward as possible. So I think that was important. And then we also thought about equity later on when we were thinking about how we planned the engagements, who we were trying to reach, how we went about that. And then finally, I would like to say we thought about equity when it came to looking at the analysis and the presentation of the results and kind of what happened there. I think we could have done more with that, but there were reasons for that, which were a lot to do with lockdown and timeframes and deadlines to get stuff ready for decision making. So yeah, but I think it starts at the beginning for me, and then if you get that bit right, it's kind of flowing a bit more.
Yeah, thanks. I'm curious as well about how did that sort of first get together, that first meeting with basically no agenda as such. How did that impact on the relationships between different stakeholders, between different people? And what do you think was made possible because you took that time to bring everybody together?
I think first of all, it was a bit messy, and I think because I was able to rock up and be a bit vulnerable and be a bit, look, right, guys, got in the room. This is roughly what, the big picture thing. We've got an opportunity to transform how we spend our money on employability, but, how do we want to make that work and how are we going to shape that? Because it was literally that opener question. Everybody had something they could say about that. And instantly people were diving into thinking about, okay, well, how would we frame this as a problem? And we started with that, what's the problem that we think we're trying to solve? And we looked at how it looks from different angles and people's different understandings of that. And then we came together with our kind of shared framing. And then that very naturally led us to then the next meeting, thinking about how are we going to shape the engagements? What are we going to do that's going to make it feel inclusive? And I think some of the things that flowed from that were, when we were originally planning this, it was before COVID. So we were planning in-person engagements and we were thinking about how we'd make them feel friendly and warm and accessible and so on. Obviously, all of that got blown totally out of the water. But we also talked about the questions that we might ask. And we wanted to make sure that when we were asking questions, whether it was in engagements or that we were also going to run a sort of survey, which we did, the questions would be the same, whether you were asking professionals or whether you were asking people who used services or who might want to use services. That's really interesting. So you're not creating an us and them in how we were approaching the inquiry. The inquiry was, kind of about everybody's experience of this thing called employability, and what that might look like. So I think that was important. And we also tried to keep it very personal. So rather than asking people questions about what other people needed, what do they need, we asked people about their experience of their own journey to work and to reflect on what had mattered in that journey, or their own experience of support, in any context, and what had mattered within that. So kind of quite big questions, which we felt could translate to, creating some new insight in terms of what we might need and want in Fife.
I really like what you said about it being okay for it to be a little bit messy, I guess that comes with relational working and being okay with figuring it out as you go, and how that led to that shared framing and creating that inclusive engagement. Gonna shift gears a little bit to think more about power. How did you think about shifting power in this work, and what did you do to make it possible? I know you've already spoken a bit about not creating the us or them and, having people with lived experience of the service involved. How did you create the conditions for them to be powerfully involved?
So I think, first of all, is a lot of co-production or engagement work. There's normally a planning team. They're quite often just professionals, and then they go and do the engagement with individual communities. So we had, our planning team was collaborative. It had a range of different perspectives on. It wasn't ideal, it wasn't perfect, it was messy, people came and went, it was, but it always had that at its heart. I think that resets power instantly, and it allows for the longer term relationships, which are actually more trusting and which actually generate a bit more dialogue. Other things around power were, in the wider engagements, we talked about ground rules. We did a lot of work around creating conditions. We tried to encourage a kind of ne high hegens, which means everyone's equal. You don't get to stand on your kind of, on your job title approach. And we tried to create spaces where everybody was encouraged to speak once before they spoke twice. So people who are dominant in those wider engagements or more confident were less likely to do that. We did not do that brilliantly or perfectly. There were a few facilitation sessions where afterwards I wasn't prepared for maybe a professional dominating or using it as an opportunity to grandstand about their service, or even actually one professional at one session just being like, no, I'm just here to listen. It's just like, no, that's another expression of power, actually. I'm not going to engage in this as another human. I'm gonna come just to listen, because I can do that. And then we did the usual things like, trying to encourage introductions, which were not about your job title, but were about your kind of, maybe just silly little questions, which allow people to kind of come as their whole self and bring something else of themselves into the room. So we did lots of little things like that, which attempted to create the conditions. But I think the ongoing facilitation in some of those wider engagement conversations were also important. I think something else, though, I want to touch on is around the use of the importance of the partnership we developed with Fife Centre for Equalities, because it wasn't just about equity in the spaces that we were hosting or within the steering group, but there was something about looking at equality in terms of what we were doing, who we were engaging with, how we were doing that, and making sure that we were really proactive in trying to reach communities who tend not to kind of come on board or get involved or have their voices heard. So we worked really closely with a local equalities organisation, Fife Centre for Equalities, and with them we devised a strategy where we worked with trusted organisations and trusted partners to reach some of those important voices. So for us, that was people from ethnic minority backgrounds, people maybe definitely from the LGBTQ plus community, because in employability services, they're quite often less visible. Again, people, young people, people with experience with the criminal justice system, and older workers. So we identified the voices that were less visible through our data in terms of the existing pathway, and then we ran targeted sessions for those particular perspectives with trusted partners. So that was really important. And then we also had an equalities form data gathering that we set up. We really encouraged, and we got really amazing response rates, like well over 60%, which I think is really high, to help us track that, so that at the end of the process or during the process, we would be able to say, actually, we're missing this voice, we're missing, we haven't got enough from here. Timeframes didn't allow us to do as much of that as we would have liked, but and COVID, but we did what we could. So that, I think, was really important as well. When it comes to power, the other thing that comes up is sometimes people say they think they misunderstand concerns around power, and they seem to think that if they have power, they should sort of let it go, or not let it go, disown it, pretend they don't have it. And something that we talked about within the steering group, and then in later projects, probably more than in No One Left Behind, was actually helping people understand how, if you are somebody who's in a position of authority, and you're engaged in a co-production process, there is a softening that you need to get in touch with around your, where your boundaries and who's in charge of what happens, without a doubt. But the question is, how do you bring your power to that co-production process rather than using it over it? Does that make sense? So it's much more about, actually, you don't have to pretend it's not there. That, there is a difference in your ability to influence and change what's going on. So let's just be honest about that, and actually talk about that and how that can help what we're trying to achieve, rather than sort of it being perceived as an unfair thing that you're somehow trying to get rid of.
That is so fascinating, because I think that comes out of a lot of our other conversations as well, that bit about we need to really think carefully about what power is and how we use power, and how we can make sure that we use power generatively. That it's okay for some people to have more power by virtue of having a certain position. It's just about, how do we also engage as human beings? How do we show to other people that doesn't make me or my perspective more important than yours, or vice versa?
No, it's actually, how can I use this to help this bigger picture? Yeah, we ended up developing something which we call the triangle of participation, or something like that. I can't remember. But one of the things we thought is really important is, whenever we're engaging in these processes and in our kind of steering group space, as much as possible, it's useful to have the perspective of strategic leads in the room, because they're more likely they can enable a lot, because they have power and influence. And if they're in the room, they're going to understand what you're recommending and why. Professionals, because professionals obviously have a great understanding of what the system really looks like on the ground, but also they have the ability to change what's happening on the ground, even if the high hegians ignore you, right? So there's a lot of potential for power to make change happen there anyway, and they can resist change if they don't like it, right? So so you want them in the room, you want them on board, and then obviously the perspective of people who are using services or who might be affected by services is also critical, because actually, by being in that space, in our experience, people can feel empowered to understand what the existing challenges are, but also to see, if it's done well, they can see how their experiences are going to benefit other people or benefit changes to the system. So then that grows their confidence in their voice as well. So if you get those three perspectives in the room, there's an uplifting of the whole, which I think is really, really beneficial. Obviously, tricky to achieve and requires, good facilitation, which is also quite tricky.
Yeah, I was just going to say it requires really skillful facilitation to make sure that, as you say, like each of these different perspectives are heard, and that nobody feels like their perspective is more important than anyone else's.
I think a lot of the stuff which we've sort of taken forward from that original piece in No One Left Behind, and which was then done in work around mental health and wellbeing, co-production work in Fife, was the importance of creating the conditions. So in any of these engagements, whether it's a bit of work that has to happen before, well, obviously a lot of work happens before the session, to make that work. I think that was one of the comments in our No One Left Behind case study. It was like, God, it felt, there was so much work that went on beforehand, and it just felt, why are we having to do this? But actually it mattered when it came to the sense of collaboration in the space. So there's a lot of work that needs to happen beforehand, but also that when we're bringing people together, you might spend at least half of the session creating the conditions where people feel safe, respected, able to come as their whole self. Professionals feel able to let down some of their barriers, some of that kind of, because there's vulnerability there too. When we talk about equity, that is also important. One of my first collaborative conversation I ever ran, we knew that there was somebody coming who had been through the mental health system and was quite vocal, sometimes quite challenging. And we spent a lot of effort kind of thinking about how we were going to kind of enable that, manage that, make sure it didn't impact on others. But also, that person could come. I didn't really think about the professionals, and actually it was somebody from DWP who left the room and, really upset by what was being discussed. So there was a lot of learning around, actually, we need to understand and create spaces which feel safe for everyone, and that takes, it takes a good bit of time at the beginning of any session and conversation.
Yeah, for sure. I think there's also a lot about kind of all of that is about trust building between people as well, isn't it? I was also really interested in the point you were making about working with trusted partners in the community. And again, that's something that seems to be coming out of a lot of our interviews. It's the role of kind of people directly in the community who don't necessarily have a very positive experience of working with public service partners. And it takes a lot of trust building, doesn't it? But they're critical to actually reaching those communities where we don't have a direct route into them.
Absolutely. And I think we were, because we're unique to Scotland, are these things called third sector interfaces, but because we were already a step away from the local authority, that possibly helped in terms of then the reach and the connection to those trusted organisations. But for us, Fife Centre for Equalities at that point, because they had months, years of relationship with the organisations, they were able to say, look, you know what, Pegs is actually, she's all right, and they, actually this is going to be an important piece of work, and it would be really great if you could make time for this. If it had been me cold calling, I can be 90% sure that most of them would have ignored me and just left me on the cold. So I do think that is absolutely critical, and that enabled us to connect. So we, for example, we worked with Pink Saltire, who were at the time the main LGBTQ plus or kind of outreach organisation in Fife, and they had existing groups which were coming together. So they very kindly welcomed us into that space. And then because it was with the Pink Saltire colleagues, people were really much more open and able to share with us there, but probably in ways that they wouldn't have done in a bigger space. So I think, I'm a big fan of the collaborative conversations where you bring everybody or as many people together as possible. But I think for some individuals in some spaces, actually having protected space which is focused on a particular issue or challenge is quite important as well. So kind of being able to be a bit flexible and horses for courses. I think sometimes when it comes to these engagements, we kind of get so stuck on the model or the structure that we forget the importance of just being able to kind of flex a bit and roll with it and and adapt to a particular issue or challenge. And I do think that's probably really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't have to kind of do one or the other when you can also find ways to do both.
Yeah, absolutely.
I wonder if you can say a bit more about sort of human learning systems. And I know that you didn't use it explicitly as a framework and within your partnership, but you used it more as your kind of maybe own guidance. But what did you learn about centering equity and inclusion through a human learning systems perspective?
I'll just mention a little bit about why it was not explicit as well, because I think that's I remember talking about human learning systems at a strategic partnership meeting, and one of the kind of very senior people in the room just being like, oh God, not another model, and and I just remember thinking at that time, okay, what we need to do is make it happen, and people can see how this is going to be useful. But yeah, I think even just the language is super helpful, right? So initially, we're first of all, we're talking about humans. Everybody in the system is a human, and as much as we can draw that out, we can help strategic leaders, professionals get in touch with their memories of their own human experiences of, say, employability in my context. That's really helpful. And then we can also help people who are using services see how human these other people are. It's not a kind of big, horrendous them or kind of, the system. But actually, the system is made up of lots of people who are kind of, muddling on through sometimes. So I think there's something about that which is helpful and really kind of guided my work. And then obviously there's the me showing up as if I'm as the facilitator or as the person supporting that group in my own messiness, and and little things like kind of our own mistakes can be helpful. So even things like not knowing how to use Zoom, that made a really big difference, because it felt like we were all a bit more human and a bit less, here we are, the professionals knowing what we're doing. So that those kind of things were really important. And then when we were thinking about presenting the findings, kind of honing those in and around people's human experience of what it is to try and get work and how that feels. And what we were able to see was that what you do when it comes to employability is important, but actually how you do it, how services are delivered, how frontline staff are working alongside people is actually as important. I would say possibly more important. You can do exactly the same. You can support someone to write a CV, or you could engage someone when thinking about what they want to do in their life in a way which is supportive and empowering, or you can do it in a way which is, I'm just going to solve this problem for you, and here you go, you've got, I'm giving extremes as an example, but so I think that was important, just humanizing the whole process and experience. And then the learning sort of insights, there was this kind of commitment in my head to continual learning as we went through the collaboration process. So, for example, we did reflections before and after each of the collaborative conversations or engagements with, we always had a balance of a professional and a lived experience facilitator supporting each of those. So there was afterwards, when there was a kind of debrief, there was reflection and learning about how it had run, but also about what we'd heard. And then when it came to kind of thinking about and analysing the findings, again, creating space to, I would have loved to have more time for that, but to try and kind of get everybody a chance to reflect on what we'd heard and use that to shape what came forward. I would say that learning process has carried on and rippled on, so that, for example, when we were looking at how we measured the impact of services that got commissioned, the shift is away from a kind of assessing them as to whether they've succeeded, they've met their targets, or they haven't, they failed, to one where we look at what's going on. So you're doing really well. Well, what's happening there, and what might we want to, learn from that we can share elsewhere, or do we need to think differently about the communities that you're working with, or just taking an inquiring stance to that. And there's similarly where things aren't working, maybe organizations aren't hitting those numbers, which is so important when it comes to employability, those job outcomes. Understanding, well, what's happening there? What are the challenges? What are the barriers? Is it something that's in the wider system that's blocking this, or is it something which is about how this service is being delivered? So I think that's really important. It sounds like such a small thing, but that is actually quite a big shift in terms of employability services, where you have traditionally, it's been kind of like, if you've got the numbers, you're fine, carry on getting money. If you haven't, then you don't. So it's a big mind shift. And then also, in terms of that's now rippling up into the what's more sort of strategic governance. So there's a sense of learning there. From an equity perspective, two of the big shifts that happened around the learning is that we have a panel of people who've used services who help assess bids. We also have I think it's still a paid lived experience representative who now sits on the oversight group, who helps contribute to some of that analysis of what's working and what isn't, and that understanding. And now a group that is going to be kind of feeding informally to the strategic local employability partnership. So kind of trying to get that happening all the way up the food chain. I think that's really important. And then in terms of systems, I suppose some of those systems that I've just talked about, getting those governance structures right means that you're more likely to have systems which learn. And again, that's all still in process. And then there are other systems that we're still working with. So, or they were still working with, around how you assess, how you look at that thing about how services delivered, not just what they deliver, and how we come up with kind of systems for reporting and thinking about how that's working and what could be better. So they're trialing sort of different reporting templates, which look at the quality of what's being delivered as much as, and the learning, so it's asking providers, what have you learned? What will you do differently? So you're kind of beginning to try and value that within the system, as well as kind of actually in the day-to-day.
Yeah, definitely. I'm also really intrigued by the fact that very often when we talk about human learning systems, it's also about recognizing that we work with complex issues. And I think particularly employability often gets really trivialized to like, oh, you could probably get a job if you wanted to, but you'd rather get benefits. So we'll make you apply for jobs to earn your benefits. And ideally, we're going to just, get you into the job. Should be a simple issue. What did that shift towards recognizing the complexity do?
That was one of the biggest outcomes from that whole process, actually. So I'm really glad you raised it, Gabriel, because it did shift our understanding in Fife, and that's now informing stuff that I'm doing nationally around employability, from this idea that it is kind of maybe a complicated issue. Here we have an unemployed person. If we just input, a bit of work experience and a CV, and some interview skills, then why wouldn't they, and some effort on their parts, then they should be able to get a job. And what we learned when we were looking at people's journeys to work and how that played out was that actually there's this really interesting and constantly interchanging combination of factors. So you've got the factors that are relevant to the individual, things that are in their either life experience, like their education and skills, or their motivation and their sense of confidence that they're even somebody that can work, and that work is something that's going to be relevant and an opportunity available to them. So you've got that happening for the individual. And those are things that you can work with as a service provider maybe and help support and grow. But also on the other side of that, you've got things like access to relevant jobs or accessible jobs. You've got transport, you've got childcare, you've got healthcare. You've got a whole host of other things. Stigma and discrimination in the workplace, a massive barrier for many, many people. You can have somebody who's the most employable person in the world, but because of their health problem or disability, or because of a language barrier, or anything, any number of things, they either might never get a job, or they might get a job but not sustain it, because even though the manager is very welcoming, who's recruited them in, the wider workforce isn't. So all of these kind of factors, when you start looking at the interplay of these individual and unique factors and these external factors, you begin to see that every single person's journey to work is going to be utterly unique. And like utterly, there is no one size fits all. And as soon as we can get people to understand that, then you start thinking about how you fund and deliver services differently, because you move from a kind of linear, kind of mechanistic, not one size fits all, but kind of quite structured approach to what employability services should look like, to something which is about how do we value reflective practice in the front line? How do we allow our frontline staff to take time to think about what each individual person needs, and how to do that in a way which is going to empower them to navigate this messiness? How do we as a governance structure understand what the other parts of the system are that we might need to be thinking about, connecting with and talking to make it more likely that the wider system is going to support somebody to work as well? These are other bits of the context. So yeah, I think that was an absolutely massive outcome. And the way I described it to someone the other day is it's a bit like, a train track. You might, employability might have been going in one direction, and all we've done with that insight is shift our understanding just a tiny bit, but actually that takes us in a very different direction from the governance level right down to the front line. And it's not to say that lots of people haven't been working in that way already. It's just that they've been doing that despite the system. Whereas now the intention is that the system supports that more.
Thanks, Pegs. I really like that holistic perspective, thinking about frontline services to governance systems all being supported, to consider how they can not just think about the individual, but the barriers within the system, and those structural inequalities that the individual might be facing or going through. Yeah, some really great stuff there.
What are some things that you feel like others could learn from your examples of practice that might help them to be more equitable in their own work?
Yes. So I think probably the first and most important thing is just start messy, and if the structure allows, make space to just bring a diverse range of perspectives together in your first ever, like, oh, how are we going to do this conversation? And if you can do that, and I recognize that not some places aren't ready for that, and you don't want to try and do that and then it be actually kind of less successful. So if you can do that, and if you can host that in a way which is messy and a bit vulnerable and a bit kind of let's muddle on through together, then who knows what could happen, and good things can happen. There is definitely something which is about brokering space up to the hierarchy and bringing them in and helping them feel confident and supported to kind of move forward in a more collaborative way. I think it is worth investing time and money in this. So I think sometimes there is a sense that this can happen in existing jobs or within existing resources, and I don't feel like that's true. I think to be done well, it takes effort and time and work, and people need space carved out to be able to do that, and to facilitate that process and journey. And I think keeping the core group kind of small but diverse is probably key to how everything else kind of rolls out. I think something about being prepared to fail and learn and also just starting where you are and doing what you can. So I think there was definitely an element for us, like this didn't happen out of nowhere. So, you know, the work that we did on No One Left Behind happened because of the work that we did around mental health and employability under something called Delivering Differently. The work that we did from Delivering Differently happened because of work that I had done many years before with the Scottish Recovery Network and others, working to recovery around mental health and kind of collaborative approaches there. So nothing comes from nothing. And actually, you know, just starting somewhere is good, because in that starting somewhere, you're going to learn, you're going to make mistakes, but it will grow your evidence base for the next thing and the next thing. And that for us has definitely had snowballed in Fife, so that by the time we were kind of, you know, had finished No One Left Behind, then there were loads of other people interested in, well, how do we do that? And can we do that in this policy space? You know, it does grow. So rather than trying to tackle the whole kind of public services system, starting with something small and focused and being able to grow with the evidence of why it's worth doing is probably, yeah, be learning, change systems.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, that part about not being afraid to fail as well, I think is so important, particularly when it comes to kind of equity. I feel like some people can be quite risk averse because they don't want to do the wrong thing. But actually there's that humility in wanting to learn in order to get it right in future, but not to let that prevent you from starting or doing anything at all.
Yeah. And that's a lot of the time, from a public servant perspective, I think that's because they have been, that's the environment they've been working in for a long time, is if you make a mistake, you will be either internally, there will be consequences, or there may be media light on what you're doing, and you may get, you know, criticism, which is going to be really difficult. So I think it is difficult. It is quite a big ask. I think leaders who are wanting to step into this space, they need to feel confident that the risks and the little mistakes are going to add up to a bigger, better impact. But we have to help with that, I think, the people that have been doing it, the people that are doing it, and understand that risk aversion is real. It's grounded in real experience. And so how do we, again, that's where the sort of maybe sometimes starting small and growing is better, because it allows that confidence, it allows the mistakes to happen at a smaller, less risky space, you know, and that does matter, actually, I think.
Exactly. That's why we need to deeply listen to the diverse experiences that people bring with them, to engage as learners rather than think that we already know the answers and know what's best. It's often really liberating, in my experience, to feel like we don't need to know everything, that when we make time to build relationships that are meaningful, then we can figure it out together. That's probably a great time to wrap up this conversation and say a big thank you to you, Pex, for sharing your insights and experiences with us. It's been really fascinating and a really enlightening conversation with lots of practical suggestions on how we can center our work around learning together from each other as human beings. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in to another episode. Be sure to check out the rest of the series as we continue to explore more examples of practice from projects and ideas around equity in human learning systems. Until next time, take care.